What did ancient humans think happened when they died? In 1955, workers digging a clay quarry outside the town of Vladimir in Russia hit something unexpected. Bones, human bones, very old ones. Archaeologists were called in. What they found took years to fully understand. Two children, a boy and a girl, roughly 10 and 12 years old, buried head to head in a narrow grave. Between them and around them, 13,000 beads carved from mammoth ivory, spears made from mammoth tusks, fox teeth, ivory discs, carved animals, red ochre poured across their bodies. Someone had estimated the labor required to make just the beads. 10,000 hours. These children had been dead for 34,000 years. And the people who buried them had spent the equivalent of 5 full years of one person's working life, making things for them to take with them. Wherever they were going, the people who loved them wanted them to be prepared. The question of what happens after death is the oldest question humans have ever asked. We know this because we stopped just leaving our dead and started burying them. We gave them things, we positioned them carefully, we marked where they were. The earliest known intentional burial is 100,000 years old. 100,000 years before writing, before agriculture, before cities, before anything we would recognize as civilization. And already, humans were behaving as if death was not the end. The problem with understanding what ancient people believed about death is that belief leaves almost no physical trace. What we have are bones, and what was buried with them. From those objects, archaeologists try to read backwards into a mind that no longer exists, into a belief system expressed entirely in things. A tool buried with a body means someone thought the dead would need tools. Food placed in a grave means someone thought the dead would be hungry. A body placed facing east, toward the sunrise, means someone thought the dead had a direction to travel. We cannot know exactly what they believed, but we can see what they did. And what they did tells us everything. The oldest burials we know of were made by people who painted their dead red. Red ochre, an iron-rich mineral found across every continent, ground into powder, poured over bodies, rubbed into bones. It appears in burials from Morocco to Australia to the Russian plain, in cultures separated by oceans and tens of thousands of years. No one agreed to do this. There was no communication between them. And yet, independently, humans across the ancient world kept choosing the same color for their dead. Red, the color of blood, the color of life. Archaeologists believe the red ochre was symbolic, a way of returning something vital to a body that had lost it, a way of saying, you were alive, you were one of us, we remember. Or perhaps something else entirely. Perhaps it was a preparation, a making ready, a way of equipping the dead for what came next. We do not know what they thought came next, but they clearly thought something did. By the time human civilizations began writing things down, the answers had already become elaborate. The Egyptians had been thinking about death longer than almost any culture in history, and what they arrived at was breathtaking in its complexity. To the ancient Egyptians, a human being was not one thing. You were several things at once. You had a physical body. You had a ka, a kind of life force or double. You had a ba, something closer to what we might call personality, the part of you that made you specifically you rather than anyone else. And you had a name, which was not just a label but a living part of your identity. When you died, all of these things had to be carefully managed. The body had to be preserved because the ba needed somewhere to return to. This is why mummification existed. Not vanity, not wealth, the body was infrastructure. The ba spent its nights in the tomb and its days flying freely. The ka needed food and offerings to survive. The name had to be spoken aloud by the living, because if your name was forgotten, you died a second time. A death with no return. And before any of this could begin, the dead had to pass a test. In the Hall of Two Truths, the heart of the deceased was weighed against a feather. The feather represented truth and justice. If your heart was heavier than the feather, a creature called Ammit was waiting. Part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, she ate the heart. And that was the end. No second chance, no mercy, just a monster and then nothing. If your heart was lighter than the feather, you passed into the field of reeds, a place that looked like Egypt but better. The crops always grew, the river always ran, The people you loved were there. The Egyptians did not invent heaven, but they described it with a specificity and longing that feels entirely modern. They wanted to go home, they just wanted it to be a better version. The ancient Greeks had a different answer, and in many ways a darker one. To the Greeks, the afterlife was not a reward, it was simply what happened. When you died, your psyche left your body, not your soul in the way we might understand it. Your psyche was more like your breath or your awareness, the thing that animated you. It traveled to the underworld, to Hades. Hades was not hell, it was not punishment, it was the place where everyone went. The virtuous and the wicked, the heroes and the cowards. Everyone arrived at the same gray, shadowy plane and waited. In most versions, the dead were shades of themselves, pale echoes. They remembered their lives but could not feel them anymore. They wandered. They murmured. They were, in a sense, homesick for a life they could no longer have. There were exceptions, Elysium for the heroic, Tartarus for the truly wicked. But for most people, for ordinary Greeks, death was not heaven or hell. It was forgetting. The river Lethe ran through the underworld. The river of forgetting. Some believed that souls drank from it before being reborn, losing all memory of who they had been. Others believed you just stayed, half-remembered, fading slowly, until the last person who had known your name also died. This is why the Greeks wrote things down, why they built monuments, why they told stories. Because a name remembered was a life extended, and a name forgotten was a death completed. The Norse believed something different again. Most of the dead went to a place called hell, not hell as punishment. Hell was simply where you went if you did not die in battle. A cold, gray, vast hall under the earth, ruled by a figure of the same name, half living and half dead. But the warriors, those who died in combat, went somewhere else entirely. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain. There, chosen by the Valkyries on the battlefield, the dead warriors spent their days doing exactly one thing. Fighting. They fought until they were killed. Then they were resurrected for dinner. They feasted. They drank. They told stories of the battle. Then the next morning, they did it again. This was not a metaphor. The Norse believed this literally. The warriors were being trained. Because Ragnarok was coming, the end of the world, the final battle between the gods and the giants, and Odin needed an army. The dead were not resting, they were preparing. Even in death, there was work to be done. This is an afterlife that tells you everything about the people who imagined it. A culture that valued endurance above all things. That saw death not as a release, but as a change of assignment. You were never done. What is strange, looking across all of these beliefs, is not how different they are. It is how similar the questions are. Every culture asks the same things. Does something survive? Where does it go? Does it remember? Will we see each other again? Is there judgment? Is there mercy? The answers varied, the questions never did. And underneath every answer, in every culture, there is the same thing. Fear, and underneath the fear, something else. Hope. The mammoth ivory beads, the food in the grave, the name written on the wall of the tomb, these were not just rituals, they were arguments. Against the possibility that death was simply the end. Against the silence that follows the last breath. Every culture that has ever existed has looked at death and decided to believe that something continues. We still do. We just use different words for it now. This is sacred and strange. Every episode we look at the oldest questions humans have ever asked and what they came up with before anyone told them what to think. Subscribe if that is the kind of thing that keeps you thinking. New episodes every week.